and for which he was later awarded the Secret Service's highest commendation. He did not reach the car in time to prevent the fatal head wound. He has said in interviews and in his memoir that in the seconds after the first shots, he told himself that if there were more, they had to hit him rather than the First Lady. Hill was present for what came next. Jackie Kennedy's shock in the back seat, the race to Parkland Memorial Hospital, and the hours that followed as doctors worked and then confirmed the president's death. He remained by her side through those days. The flight back to Washington aboard Air Force One with the president's coffin, the funeral planning that fell, by cruel coincidence, on John Jr.'s 3rd birthday, and the funeral itself, during which, by his own account, his composure broke more than once. One image from that day has become inseparable from the historical record. Jacqueline Kennedy's refusal to change out of her blood-stained pink suit before Lyndon Johnson's swearing in aboard Air Force One and again after arriving in Washington. She is widely quoted as having said she wanted people to see what they had done. Hill, who was present, came to understand this not as shock overtaking her, but as a deliberate act. Jackie Kennedy choosing, even in the worst hours of her life, to control how the truth of that day would be seen. The public narrative of November 22nd settled, for decades, into a story about heroism and tragedy at the level of the nation. What Hill's later account added was the interior cost carried by the people standing closest to it. He has said plainly, in interviews around the release of his memoir, that he spent years believing he should have reacted faster, that a fraction of a second, differently used, might have changed what happened. That belief metastasized into what he and others have called survivor's guilt. Recurring, intrusive memories of the sound of the shots, the sight of Jackie Kennedy reaching toward the back of the car, the blood on the seat. He has described insomnia, deep depression, and, after retiring from the Secret Service in 1975, following a career that also included protecting Presidents Eisenhower, Johnson, Nixon, and Ford, years spent largely isolated, drinking, and struggling to function, a period he has said in interviews brought him close to the edge of wanting to end his own life. This was, as Hill and others who study the Kennedy detail have pointed out, an era with essentially no clinical framework for what would today be recognized as post-traumatic stress. There was no formal support offered to Secret Service agents who had witnessed a presidential assassination at close range. Hill's account of those lost years is one of the more sobering parts of his memoir precisely because it resists sentimentality. He does not describe a redemption arc so much as decades of quiet difficulty, followed eventually by a slow, partial recovery aided by therapy by his second wife and co-author Lisa McCubbin, and, he has said, by finally telling the story. If you are experiencing thoughts of suicide or are in crisis, you can reach the 988 Suicide Crisis Lifeline by calling or texting 988 in the United States, or find international crisis resources at findahelpline.com. Breaking decades of silence. For nearly 50 years, Hill declined to discuss the assassination or his years with Jackie Kennedy publicly in any detail. That changed with a landmark 1975 CBS interview with Mike Wallace, in which he first spoke about his guilt on camera, but it was not until his memoirs, beginning with Mrs. Kennedy and Me in 2012 and continuing with 5 Days in November 2013 and other books, that he offered a sustained, detailed account. Reviewers and readers have consistently noted Wayao's that the book is not a tell-all. Kirkus Reviews described it as written in clear and honest prose free from salaciousness and gossip. Hill himself was reportedly reluctant for years to publish anything, in part out of loyalty to Jackie Kennedy's own well-documented desire for privacy. She rarely gave interviews about her White House years and discouraged those close to her from doing so. His eventual decision to write was less an act of revelation for its own sake than what he and his co-author have described as an attempt to honor her memory honestly on the 50th anniversary of events that had shaped both of their lives. What emerges in the book is not a hidden scandal, despite how it is sometimes marketed. It is a portrait of a working relationship that deepened over 4 years of shared travel and shared crisis into something closer to devotion, and a record of what that devotion cost the man who carried it. Some reviewers, including researchers focused on the Kennedy assassination, have cautioned that Hill's reconstructed dialogue from decades earlier should be read as an old man's best recollection rather than verbatim transcript, a fair caveat for any memoir written half a century after the fact. A complicated inheritance, Clint Hill died in 2025, having spent his final decades as one of the last living witnesses to the Kennedy White House and to Dallas. In addition to Mrs. Kennedy and me, he wrote 5 Days in November, 5 Presidents, My Extraordinary Journey with Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, and Ford, and My Travels with Mrs. Kennedy. A body of work that, taken together, tracks both the sweep of mid-century American history and one man's long, difficult accounting with his place in it. His story resists a tidy moral. It is not simply a story of heroism, though the footage of him running for the car remains one of the most watched pieces of film from that day. It is not simply a story of tragedy, though tragedy runs through nearly every chapter of it, from Patrick's death to Dallas to the years Hill spent afterward in what he has called the dark. It is, more than anything, a record of what it costs to stand that close to history. To be, for 4 years, one of the very few people trusted to see a public woman's private exhaustion, grief, and grace, and then to spend the next 50 years learning how to speak about it without betraying either her trust or his own long silence. What Hill ultimately offered in breaking that silence was not a secret in the sense of scandal. It was something more ordinary and, in its way, more affecting, an honest account of 2 people, a First Lady determined not to be reduced to an image, and the agent assigned to protect her, each finding a way to carry an unbearable weight without letting it show. He gave the historical record something it rarely allows for public figures and the people who serve them, the plain, unglamorous truth of what the job took out of him. Sources: Clint Hill and Lisa McCubbin, Mrs. Kennedy and Me, An Intimate Memoir, 2012. Contemporaneous news coverage of the birth and death of Patrick Bouvier Kennedy, August 1963. The Warren Commission record, and subsequent historical accounts of the events in Dallas on November 22, 1963. Published reviews and interviews accompanying the release of Hill's memoirs. When Clint Hill was assigned to the First Lady's Secret Service detail in November 1960, he was 32 years old, a farm boy from North Dakota who had already spent 2 years protecting President Eisenhower. Guarding Jacqueline Kennedy sounded on paper like the easier post, a young mother, not a head of state. Hill would later say the assumption was wrong almost immediately. Jackie Kennedy was restless, private, fiercely independent, and determined not to let the presidency swallow her identity. Protecting her meant something closer to shadowing a moving target than standing post at a door. Over the next 4 years, that assignment became the defining relationship of Hill's life. He documented it decades later in his own words, in the best-selling memoir Mrs. Kennedy and Me, co-written with journalist Lisa McCubbin and published in 2012, nearly 50 years after the events it describes. What follows draws on that record, along with the historical facts of the Kennedy years, rather than on invented dialogue or imagined inner thoughts. The true story, it turns out, needs no embellishment. Jackie Kennedy's public image in the early 1960s was almost impossibly polished. The pillbox hats, the state dinners, the restoration of the White House's historic interiors, the magazine covers. Hill's account complicates that image without diminishing it. He described a woman who loved horses, art, architecture, and literature with real intellectual seriousness, not as ornamental hobbies. She resisted being treated as a passive accessory to her husband's office, insisting on a degree of normalcy for herself and her children. Swimming, riding, and time away from cameras whenever she could carve it out. He also described the physical and social demands of the role. State visits to Paris, Greece, India, Pakistan, Italy, Mexico, Venezuela, and Morocco, along with the family's regities. Euler retreats to Hyannisport and Palm Beach. Traveling with Jackie Kennedy meant navigating language barriers, foreign security services, and crowds that in some countries surpassed the reception given to the president himself, most famously in Paris in 1961, when President Kennedy joked that he was the man who accompanied Jacqueline Kennedy to Hill was present too for the ordinary and the domestic, the Kennedy family's competitive games of touch football, the children's routines, the small kindnesses Jackie extended to the agents around her. Over 4 years, what began as a formal, uncertain working arrangement became, in Hill's own description, a comfortable and enjoyable working relationship based on mutual trust and respect. Losing Patrick. The Kennedys' third child, Patrick Bouvier Kennedy, was born prematurely on August 7, 1963, at Otis Air Force Base Hospital in Massachusetts, 5.5 weeks before his due date. He weighed just over 4 pounds and suffered from hyaline membrane disease, a respiratory condition common in premature infants of that era, for which effective treatment did not yet exist. He was transferred to Boston Children's Hospital, where specialists attempted to save him. He died on August 9, 1963, 2 days after he was born. It was a private tragedy that unfolded in a public family, and Hill was among those closest to it. The loss came less than 4 months before Dallas, and biographers and Hill himself have noted that Jackie's grief over Patrick was still raw when the family traveled to Texas that November, part of why the trip was, in some accounts, meant partly to help her return to public life. On November 22, 1963, Hill was riding on the running board of the follow-up car, immediately behind the presidential limousine, as the motorcade moved through Dealey Plaza in Dallas. When the first shots rang out, he ran forward and leapt onto the back of the moving limousine, an act captured in the